Morning as we continue in the ongoing battle of the streaming services. We, yeah. Oh, hey, had it all working good Wednesday. Then that danged crowd strike thing happened. And then I don't know what happened after that, but I do know this. We're in a happy world today because we got a couple of fine guests, and I got Cliff here to manage it. So I'm gonna let Cliff manage all of this, and I'm going to go manage the background.
All righty, Bob. Thank you. So I have two wonderful guest writers today. The first, longtime viewers will know, returning is Deborah J. Ross, who sometimes writes as Deborah Wheeler. She is the author of Jadium, Northlight, and the Lambda-nominated Collaborators, as well as 8 Darkover books, the ninth of which is about to come out. Yeah, there's Collaborators, wonderful book. And the Seven Petals Shield fantasy series, and the editor of a number of anthologies, including Lace and Blade 1 through 4, and Darkover, and so forth and so on. And here for the first time, we have Patricia C. Wrede, who is the author of many books, starting with the Lyra series, Shadow Magic, the Enchanted Forest Chronicles, including the wonderful Dealing with Dragons, and Star Wars junior novelizations for the prequel trilogy, and most recently, The Dark Lord's Daughter, which just came out last year, and she is reputedly working on a sequel. So, yes, thank you very much for coming today, both of you. Also, Pat has warned us that in her location, which is Chicago area, Minneapolis area, sorry, I knew it was somewhere in the Midwest. They're having thunderstorms, so she could have an outing at any moment. But right now, she is with us. And today's subject is monarchies. We are all Americans in the room here right at the moment. There are not always Americans on this show, but there's a lot of them. And 240 odd years ago, we kicked out George III and decided we wanted to try this democracy thing. That's how it started. How's it going now? Well, it's had its ups and downs. But there are a significant number of Americans who seem to want autocracy again. And certainly literature, especially the literature of fantasy and science fiction, has had a lot to do with monarchy. I've got here a Dune mug, which posits a future, over 10,000 years in the future, humanity is ruled by an emperor and a bunch of dukes and barons and things that make up the Landsrat that balances the power with the emperor. But the commoners are basically have no civil rights whatsoever. So that's kind of dystopic. But also in fantasy literature, we have a lot of kings and queens and princes, and you can blame the Brothers Grimm or you can blame Walt Disney, but it's also in Tolkien in a big bad way, right? And even Michael Moorcock, who is basically an anarchist, wrote about princes and kings and emperors like Elric of Melniboné, despite himself almost, because that's so big in the genre. So we're going to talk today about monarchies and nobility and the lasting fascination with all of that, including the trappings, and even weird situations like, for example, in the Darkover universe, where you have the towers and stuff like that. It's not quite exactly feudal, but that was a popular trope in science fiction. Societies that started off high tech and falling back to kind of a feudalism, like Darkover and the Dragon Riders of Pern series. So, but of course, in fantasy, it's a big thing as well. So, would anyone like to jump in and talk about like their initial foray? Maybe when you were a kid and you were getting into fantasy and science fiction, how much did this kind of monarchy and yeah, we have a Canadian saying monarchy is fine with limits. I agree. We could debate what the limits should be, though. Um, but anyway, anyone want to dive in and talk about their formative years and how that shaped your love of genre and whatnot?
Well, okay. I'll go first if you want. The the thing about monarchies in fantasy, first off, it is the thing that sticks out. But if you actually look at the broad sweep of fantasy, I don't think it is that prevalent. It sticks out because it is kind of in the forefront of our brains. But if you look at the field as a whole, if you look at fairy tales, you look at collections of fairy tales. Look at the Andrew Lang fairy books. I once went back. I loved the Andrew Lang fairy books when I was a kid. And yes, there are a couple of them which have almost all, they're full of princes and princesses and so on. But most of them include things like The Little Tailor, which is not about a prince or a princess, it's about a con man. It includes Why the Sea is Salt, which is about a guy and a sailor taking a magic salt mill, and the ship's sinking and the salt mill is still grinding away down in the depths of the ocean. It includes things like The Fisherman and His Wife, which is kind of an anti-monarchy thing where the wife wants more and more power until she's empress of the universe, and then she wants something else and she can't get it, so she's back being a fisherman's wife again. You know all of these things, and that I would argue that the three most well-known fantasies of our generation are The Wizard of Oz, which has no monarchy in it at all, The Lord of the Rings, in which the hero has nothing to do with monarchies. That's not how the Shire is run. And the monarchy doesn't even really get reestablished until, and it's even kind of off on the side. It's not the main point of the book. It's there. But real world, we have real world monarchies still. They're just kind of not where I live yet, I hope. But and the third one is Harry Potter, which again, no monarchy. Unless you count the monarchy of England, which we're back to monarchies with limits and so on. The other thing is that I've known since I was very young that what people think of as monarchy, for the most part, is a shorthand, totally oversimplified version. It's used frequently as a synonym for an absolute dictatorship, which it isn't. There are very few monarchies that have actually been that. The king has to deal with the nobles. The monarch in England was first among the barons equally to begin with. And so it's a lot more complex. So that's kind of where I came down. I've been aware of those things. I got interested in just sort of the historical backgrounds of things, partly because of fairy tales and sword and sorcery, and really realizing very quickly that what was in the books was a drastically oversimplified version, and it's used as a shortcut. So that's kind of my initial comments.
I'm going to go two ways. The first one is short, which is that my my introduction to the book that really captured me for the field was Andre Norton's Beastmaster, which has no monarchy at all. And
Yes.
then I just grabbed everything that I could of hers. And this is pre-Witch World. So it's things like Storm over Warlock and just all of that early. And her heroes were underdogs, by and large. Yes, always underdogs fighting their way up. So that for me, that would have been mid to late 60s. And in the 70s, there was this explosion of stuff written by women. And, I could babble off the list, but these writers were not interested in traditional monarchies. They were interested in gender and power and women's adventures generally.
Yeah, when I think about the books in the field that spoke to me, very few of them involve monarchies. The people that I hear complaining about, fantasy is all monarchy, either tend to be either people who don't read in the field widely, or their only exposure to fantasy is like the Disney princesses, or they're people within the field who have been told this and who are worried about it, even though they don't do it that way themselves or read that. They don't notice that the complaints are, yeah.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So I was thinking about why monarchies of whatever flavor keep popping up, mostly in fantasy, some science fiction, although science fiction tends to play with political structures a little bit more fluidly. And I came up with that a king or queen, a monarch, first of all, has agency in a way that common people may not in that society. So in The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, Tolkien, I just read an essay about The Hobbit, where the guy pointed out that how modernist Bilbo is. That first of all, he smokes tobacco, but also a lot of his ideas don't fit with the king kind of structure. So, and he does have agency, but if you look at a feudal type of society and you want a hero who is able to do things, you don't want somebody who is, working 16 hours a day and is starving. You need somebody who gets enough food, who can take off on his horse, who has a horse, and stuff like that. The other thing, which is to me more interesting, is that the king is a stand-in for a whole bunch of things. It could be the warlord bully. It could be the guy who has the magical thing. It could be the big evil oppressor of the land. It could be the head priest, which ties into the divine right of kings stuff. It could be the wounded hero that needs to be protected, and then that ties into the absent king, like in the Robin Hood stories. You have a king, but he's off someplace, and then you have the substitute evil oppressor king. And most interestingly, the king is the chosen one. So I might argue that the Harry Potter stories are very monarchical because Harry is the chosen one, just like in the Sword in the Stone, King Arthur was the chosen one, the guy who pulled the sword out of the stone. And Harry Potter is the guy who does all of this, not because he has earned it, but because he is predestined from birth to do all of these great things.
Yeah, well, if you're talking about the chosen one trope thing, then the whole argument becomes kind of moot because you can tag that with every hero of every book ever. It's like they are the ones who the author or somebody within the book, but they were picked to have these adventures and do these heroic things. And that's every book ever written, whether it's fantasy or not. And it is metaphorical though. I think that the metaphor, the king as metaphor, is really I think that's the draw for writers. Is the king is a really good and relatively easy metaphor for authority and agency,
Mm-hmm.
especially and historically. Yeah, if you're writing a medieval fantasy, they were the ones, the nobility were the ones who had agency. And people in general have always been just really fascinated with the lives of the rich and the famous. And the fact that you have, I mean, we still are, they're just, Hollywood actors and very rich people like Bill Gates and Warren Buffett. And people are fascinated with that, I think, because those people have the ability, the agency, and the ability to affect ordinary people who cannot respond in kind. So it's really kind of important to know what the guy on the top is liable to come and trample all your crops and burn your house down for some unknown reason. So yeah, King makes a really good shorthand for that kind of authority, agency, and power in a society, in every society.
So a couple of examples of monarchy in popular fiction. George R. R. Martin's Song of Ice and Fire, filmed as Game of Thrones, is of course a throne war, right? It's the War of the Roses in a fantasy setting. And that's all about who gets to be the monarch, right? And every once in a while, one of the characters is like thinks about the small people, and then a page later dismisses the idea because they're too busy trying to not get killed or whatever. It's a really rough world. Another, of course, big monarchy is the Galactic Empire in Star Wars, right? So, and even Star Trek has the mirror universe with the Empire, and so you have the Democratic Federation of Planets as seen as the good universe, and the Empire seen as the bad universe, because monarchy, right? So that's the message.
And I would also argue that on board the Enterprise or any ship, the captain stands in for the king. He's the one that gives the orders. Right? Yeah, you do not have a
Horatio Hornblower.
Yeah.
People organize themselves in hierarchies. And if you are a part of a hierarchy, and everybody is part of a hierarchy at some point in some aspect of their lives, we can't avoid it. It's how we organize ourselves. And when you're in a hierarchy, who is at the top of the hierarchy and what they can and cannot do to you is really important. So it is a one of those sort of universal topics, like love and death, that
Sure.
is that it is going to be, and kings are a metaphor for that, and an example of that, and yeah.
One of the more fascinating critiques of humanity was delivered by the aliens in Octavia E. Butler's Xenogenesis trilogy, rebranded as Lilith's Brood. The first book, Dawn, the last survivors of a nuclear war are rescued by aliens who have a really very different sense of consent than we do, but they critique humanity and say, well, the reason you ran into this dead end was that you are both intelligent and hierarchical. And that's a deadly combination that leads to self-destruction. So that was quite, I think, an incisive observation, by Octavia, that she put into an alien from their point of view. And the aliens are not entirely good either. They really they're like, okay, well, you've destroyed yourselves, so you've given us implied consent to do whatever we want, and it's not it's not very nice. So at least not all. They're trying, but they're aliens. So that's a thing. And in like Dune, of course, you do have a balance between the Emperor and the Landsrat of all the barons and dukes and presumably earls and counts and things. But if you're not one of the noble family, if you are one of the noble family, you better know about poisons and blades because they're coming for you. But if you're not one of the noble family, your life is, you have no civil rights. Any noble could just kill you on a whim, and so it doesn't matter to you whether your boss is a baron or the emperor himself, because your life is not worth anything. You don't have agency. You're either like a shopkeeper who could get killed at random when a duke comes in and doesn't like the boots he sold him, or you're a soldier, and even the Fremen, they're pretty. I mean, they have leaders, right? And they have a structure that's sort of a tribal leader, but the very high mortality rate and all of that. It's not presented as a good system by any means. Another really fascinating. Bob is saying, consider the vulnerabilities of the monarchy and permissions they need to rule. Actually, Bob, I was about to get to that point, so thank you for that segue. The Snow Queen series by Joan D. Vinci imagines a planet called Tiamat that has a very long seasons, summer and winter, because of its orbital mechanics, and there is a Snow Queen and a Summer Queen. And the tribe, the summers and the winters, rule for a couple hundred years, something like that, 150 years, whatever. But if you happen to be the last queen for your season, you get sacrificed to the ocean, like literally drowned, along with your consort in a special ceremony. And that's, you have a lot of power up until the moment you are ritually sacrificed, but then you don't. You're dead, and the baton passes to the other tribe. And the Snow Queen is the whole series is kicked off by the fact that the Snow Queen wants to continue her reign into summer, and since she cannot do that as an immortal queen, she wants to do it with a clone, right? And so and position that clone to become her successor and someone that she can train to be just like her, right? And that's her evil monarch plot that kicks off the whole novel series. And so you have monarchy, but you have the limitations of monarchy. And then there are other governments shown, like the Karamogis are more like us, but they have oligarchy kind of situation going there, right? It's a technocrat oligarchy in their society. And then there are the planets that are all supposed to be in this sort of loose federation, supposed to be equal, but Karamog is first among equals in that system. And Tiamat is, basically a third world country in space. So being exploited by the more technologically advanced planets. So you have all of these different power dynamics at play, but at its heart, you have a kind of concept of monarchy, including the ritual ruler sacrifice trope, played out.
I think the contrast between dynastic monarchy and I'm not sure what you would call it, where the king candidates for king have to prove themselves, elective monarchy. So
right, yeah, there's a
Macbeth, that's what
they have to do in that book.
Yeah. There's a lot more variation than that. I mean, there's the ones where a king is actually democratically elected to then be, Poland did that for a while. Where the king was elected democratically from a group of nobles. They didn't get to appoint their own successor, but then they were king until they died. There's the primogeniture model, which England uses, where the eldest son gets everything. There was the model which caused, if you ever looked at a map of medieval Germany, tiny, teeny little, tiny, teeny little kingdoms. And I mean, it's no wonder that that's where the Grimm's fairy tales with all the princes and princesses come from, because they had 8 million different tiny little countries. Because every time they had more than one kid, they sliced up the country and gave each of them their own piece of it. And so the countries got smaller and smaller until you had this, and then they had to start conquering each other in order to get big again.
So you had a kind of fractal situation going.
Yeah, and then you have things like oligarchies, which can be a true oligarchy, but which are fraught with politics, because in an oligarchy you have a ring of like 6 people, all of whom really want to be on top, but they're not. So you have this incredible politicking to try and come out on top, which I think Cesare Borgia did a fine job of in his day. But you have these things. There are multiple ways that monarchies work visibly and invisibly, and the one that you see when you see it in most fantasies is kind of oversimplified. And things like the science fiction, the Snow Queen, do a much better job of covering some of the complexity or the possible complexities of how monarchies might work.
So many times in fantasy, I see the model of you have a king who might be fallible, but is wise and has his people's best interests at heart. And then the eldest son gets trained for a life of service, and also as a war leader and a judge. And it's like, Superman gives rise to Superman 2 kind of thing. And yes, oversimplified, because just because your father was the biggest bully on the block does not qualify you, no matter how much education you have, to do a really good job. And then I question whether kings can do a really good job, just from the nature of having so much power in one person.
Yeah, if you look at the history of monarchies, it is really common for a really good king to be followed by a really bad one.
Yes.
Because being a good king does not make you a good parent, and does not mean that you can raise a good king.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that gets, again, oversimplified.
Yeah, which is, also leads to the nobility's tendency to farm out parenting to various servants, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or the fosterage system.
Yeah.
Which was a very medieval thing.
Very
which
much.
You don't see much of that in most fantasies. It's the feudal government was not monarchical. It was a different system, and that is completely, except for like scholars, that tends to completely vanish in the popular imagination.
Sure. So then you get the things like Star Wars, which is a quintessentially American space fantasy in many ways. But so the big bad is, of course, the Emperor, who has seized power and destroyed the Republic. But some of the heroes, there's Princess Leia, right? And Queen Amidala. So, when I first saw The Phantom Menace and found out that they literally elect a teenage girl queen of their planet every few years and then swap her out after her term of office is done. in which she does appear to be very much like an absolute monarch, or at least a buck stops here kind of leader. I kept thinking of that bit in Monty Python and the Holy Grail where they run into the communist peasants and, well, who are you then? I'm your king. Well, I didn't vote for you. You don't vote for kings, but apparently you vote for queens if you're on Naboo. So that's a really strange kind of way of doing a monarchy. I mean, yeah, science fiction does experiment with different kinds of government, but it's not what the normal viewer or reader would think of as
not in America.
Yeah.
That is a very Chinese and Japanese model where the king was actually not the person running the government. And frequent in Japan during the shogunate, the shogun was running it, and the king either didn't last very long, like age 20, because a young king was a lot easier to be regent for and rule and do everything without them objecting, and it became ensconced in tradition. In China, it was more the king was out doing all the ceremonial stuff and being the public face of the monarchy, and when their eldest son got to a certain point, the king would retire. And the new young king would be the face of the monarchy and run everything and be out there. And the old king and his advisors would be the ones who are actually making the rules and running the country. And, so that model of the young person is the face of the monarchy, and they look to everybody else as if they're doing it, but the power is really behind the throne. Mm-hmm. And it's a very, very, that was how, for centuries, China and Japan and possibly other of the Asian countries that I'm not as familiar with the governing systems that they may have worked. But yeah, it is an actual model of how people in certain societies did things. You had the young king who looked powerful but was powerless, and the shogun, the regent, or the old king who was really the one running things. Or the council of old kings, if any of them lasted long enough, so that you had dad and granddad are back there running the show while you're out here at the age of 20 doing the publicity stuff.
So I'm just tickled by the notion of appointing somebody monarch whose prefrontal cortex is not fully matured.
Right?
But so yes, young and glamorous and 20-year-olds are so sure of themselves anyway going to make proclamations, but actually they have very little power to affect anything of importance. Maybe the style of the court or other things 20-year-olds are interested in.
Well, certainly on the planet Naboo, you elect a teenager, and she does appear to actually have the power, although they don't, Palpatine seems to think that she is going to be easily manipulated because she's a teenager. So perhaps there's a history on their planet of easily manipulated monarchs. I don't know, but, she's certainly willing to roll up her sleeves and, fire guns that pull up ropes and things. Anyway, whatever. And she
also leaves the point of, she also ceases to be queen and becomes senator.
Yeah,
because that is a position of greater power.
Certainly in the galactic level, yes.
And but it's she's not.
Sure. So. Bob in our private chat is asking about king's advisors, councils, and stuff. There's a lot of that in Gloriana by Michael Moorcock, where it's basically a fantasy version of Queen Elizabeth I's court, to the point where actually John Dee is a character, and there's like Lord Malfalcon and all these other characters, and there's a lot of ink around the advisors of the king. So Yeah, I mean, those can make interesting characters depending on. Okay, so let's say you're a writer, hypothetically, and you're wanting to write a book, hypothetically, and you want to create maybe a monarchy. Why would you choose monarchy? Would you include, advisors, knights, that kind of subjects, but subjects with agency? As well, would you include a chapter from the point of view of the junior assistant chef, slaving away in the kitchens and that sort of thing? How would you approach doing this in 2024 if you're writing a book?
Well, a couple of things. I mean, I did. Oops.
Excellent.
Oh, yes.
I may have stacked the deck with my choice of guests.
Yeah, that's the middle book. So, Seven Petal Shield started as a series of short stories in Sword and Sorceress, and I was sick to death of Western European models, so I got interested in the conflict between the Romans and the Scythians, and so Central Asian horse nomads. Very mobile, tribal structure. Yeah, you'd have a war leader and then he'd get demoted as soon as the war was over, which was usually really fast, and you'd go back to cattle raiding. Versus very hierarchical, organized empire on conquest. But when it came to write a novel or three, you need another axis of power. And so I threw in a very ancient, scripturally literate guardians of magic way up in the mountains culture. And I didn't actually, I mean, the Rome analog, yes, you have an emperor, in this case, one who is just fixated on conquest, and he can't get anywhere with the horse nomads. They just lure his men into canyons and moon them from a safe distance, and so he attacks the mountain community. And I didn't actually think about how that might be ruled other than by a king with a council, and each of the major families is represented by the council. And in times of war, like let's go defend the city, the king and his eldest son ride out to, But my protagonist is the queen. I was a very young second wife, and what she is doing is she's off saving the library during the siege. Yes, yes, I really fell in love with her when she told me she was doing that. And so for the first book, the central relationship is between her as an exile and refugee and her adolescent son. And this sort of circles back to what I was talking about, the king as stand-in, the king with a magical thing. And through a series of accidents, she becomes the guardian of the magical thing. And eventually, she eventually, there are other magical things that have been lost and get found by other people. I wanted to contrast the politics of the Rome analog, where you have poison plots and you have a brother who's got a club foot and congestive heart failure, who's actually the nicest person in the court, but cannot be in line of succession because he's not physically perfect, and just a lot of backbiting and backstabbing and all of that stuff with my horse nomads. And here's my horse nomad heroine, who's pretty I was pretty kick-ass, and how the word of her grandmother is carries more weight than the word of the war leader. So it's a very fluid power structure. And there are a lot of ways around custom, especially for women. Um, yeah, I'm going to go sideways here. I did this in collaborators, yay collaborators, where
Lambda nominated collaborators.
this occupation and resistance story set on a planet where the native race is gender fluid. And humans come to it with all kinds of assumptions. Maybe today they would do better, but I wrote this in the mid 90s. Anyway, there are nations and they have different forms of government, but there's also my sort of mishmash of elements of the Jewish community and the Quakers with whom I had been hanging out. And they get together and look for consensus as a community before they take any particular action, and it drives the governments nuts. And I can't, maybe someday I will write a story where that is the dominant form of government, where in order to make any decision, you have to discuss and discuss until you all agree that you have achieved unity on this. And it may take several generations, but it would be fun. It would
Reminds
be
me of the Entmoot in Two Towers.
Yeah. Or it's John Slozinski, I think I said her name right, writes Quaker thought-based stories. There's somebody else. There's a couple of other people that will weave those concepts of it's the equality of voice, and that I'm going to go sideways. And I find this particularly Jewish way of looking at things, that if we are called to understand what we are led to, whether by scripture or, Torah study or, whatever, then we need to figure out what that is as humans. But we're fallible. So who knows whose viewpoint is right? Therefore, we are religiously obligated to argue about everything and to listen to every voice.
And the Talmud preserves the minority opinion in
Yes.
every case.
Right. Over 200 years of discussion.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So, Pat, you've recently written the Dark Lord's Daughter and are working on book 2. And so that's an interesting system of government you've created for that. Would you like
I have never started a book by worrying about what the government was going to be like. They always start with a character or a plot idea or something else. And what the government is like is determined by the story that I want to tell and the setting that I want to use for it. If I'm using medieval Europe, I'm pretty much required to have monarchies around, because that was what everybody was in the Middle Ages in Europe. There really were not a lot. There were a few oligarchic free cities, but for the most part, the countries, Spain, France, Italy, they were monarchies. If I'm writing in Regency England, they were a monarchy. Under a regency, but still a monarchy with a noble class, and that was the important thing. If I'm writing in an alternate universe America, it's a democracy. It's, it is the setting and the story that I want to tell determines the government, not the other way around. That said, Dark Lord's Daughter involves a young woman who is, she knows she's adopted. She was raised in our world. And at 14, she and her remaining adopted family are kidnapped back to the fantasy world from which she came, because she was the daughter of the previous Dark Lord. And who sent people off to hunt for her, and now she is expected to come and take back the kingdom, and rule and become the next Dark Lady. And her reaction is, wait a minute, my dad was one of the bad guys. What about this? So she is not at all what they are expecting. And her family is not at all what they are expecting. But there's a lot of stuff that I don't say explicitly in the books about the way the governments work, but it is very much a light versus dark universe taken to its parody extreme, where in the first book, two of the native characters get into an argument over just how many final battles there have been between the light and the dark. And it's like when World War I happened, everybody called it the Great War, the war to end all wars. And then came World War II. And how do you have, how does that work? And in their minds, it's the same sort of thing. It was the final battle, and we're up to 148. No, they're 143. Those other 5 don't count. So they have this argument, and the Americans are looking at them and sort of going, how can you have more than one final battle? This makes no sense. But to them, it does. The ruling class has, they have this cyclical thing going on. And she's basically, once she gets into power after the first book, she's basically working on trying her best to upend a lot of the traditions and things that have led to this. So she's she's kind of an anti-monarch. They don't call her a monarch. She's the Dark Lady, but it's playing around with the tropes and the expectations. And I had a lot of fun with the first book. I'm having even more fun with the second book. Mm-hmm. It's a lot of fun. And of course, her 10-year-old brother has played every computer game in the world and been on the internet since the beginning and of his life, and is constantly, when they come and they ask, are you going to cut out, when are you going to perform the ritual to hide your heart in the inside the egg of a dove, in the nest of the eagle, across the ocean, the fairy tale trope thing. And her mother is like, what? And her little brother goes, oh yeah, they do that a lot. It never works. And Kayla's like, okay, then we're not doing it. I'm not about things that don't work. So I'm having a lot of fun with it. But it is definitely not it's more about the illusion of monarchy, because we're seeing it from Kayla's viewpoint, and she's not completely conversant with the society, but the ordinary people in this society are just sort of going about their business, ignoring this game that the upper classes are playing amongst each other as much as they possibly can, which I think is, and she's in a lot more sympathy with them than with all these, traditions and whatnot. So it's kind of subverting some, I hope is subverting some of the tropes.
Well, in book 2, you find out there are some characters with their own organizations and agendas
Yes.
that are completely separate power hierarchy.
Yes, it's not just two sides hitting, butting heads. There are at least 3.
I would say at least 4 if you count the.
Yes.
Yeah.
Guilds.
So yeah. Which is fascinating. So yeah, at this point, we got about 10 minutes left. Bob in the private chat has asked about God kings or God queens. So I think we can segue into a sort of a more metaphorical thing. The genres of fantasy and science fiction, and to an extent horror, are often centered around not just nobility, but like Ubermenschen, right? Like really powerful beings. The Chronicles of Amber by Roger Zelazny are an example of that. So you have a prince, a royal prince, who also has superpowers and is immortal, and whose dad is the immortal God King, Oberon. And how does that play out? And so, what you want to talk about how our fascination with, on the one hand, when we often create as writers in the genres situations that it would be really tough for a regular schmo to survive, right? So we give our protagonists superpowers or an enchanted sword or divine help or something to enable them, or just dumb luck, like the luck of Tila Brown in Ringworld, something to help them survive the catastrophic situations we're about to throw at them. Whereas, and this is partly like The Chosen One, because after all, as Pat pointed out, every protagonist is the chosen one by the author, like, whether they're ready or not. and so, we give these powers. So there's a conflation on some level of the power of monarchy and the power of superpowers, right? And even when your superpowered character, who is literally like Clark Kent slash Kal-El, who's like fighting for democracy, is still a superpowered character, right? And so there's kind of an adjacent element there. So do you want to talk about that? I personally lately have been getting into stories in which the protagonist is not superpowered in any way and is having to just deal with the fact that, yeah, they're chosen by the author, but they're not really set up for this task. Their ability to survive the book has something to do with some other characteristic that just happened to work out, right?
Yeah. I think it's just I think the superpowered God King is a combination of two things. One is the king has all the power and all the authority, pulling it all the way over to the edge, because we're all too aware that an ordinary person is, you put a crown on his head and you call him a king. He really only has the power that he is given by the office, and in order to have that archetypal agency power, we can do anything. You have to give him superpowers and make him a god. So that's one of the things that's going on. And the other gets back to the whole fascination with the lives of the rich and powerful. One of the consistent themes of every one of those things, from the I, Claudius to the modern reality shows, is people can be rich, they can be powerful, they can be famous, and they can still have miserable love lives and all kinds of personal problems. And that superpowers do not help if your mother is dying of cancer.
Well, that's like Spider-Man, right?
Yeah, Spider-Man is a really good example of that. So you've got both of those things happening, and they appeal in different ways to different writers and different stories.
Sure.
So the good king who has God divine powers, and sees all and is ultimately good, is really boring. Okay, put him off on a different planet and let's have some interesting, conflict driven stuff here. So that's one thing you can do is you can have the good God King just absent, somewhere else, which means that he or she is inherently not omniscient, because otherwise the problem wouldn't arise. Um, the plot problem wouldn't arise. So you can have the God King have, warts and hemorrhoids and, a bad marriage and whatever. Or you can have the trickster in the court who comes to the court who outwits this supposedly omnipotent God King. And that's an interesting story right there, because our sympathies are not with the king. The boring
Right back to Taylor.
they're with the fox.
Sure. Well, there's that wonderful cartoon with Bugs Bunny and Yosemite Sam where Bugs knocks on the door of the castle, and the person who answers is the cook, who is Yosemite Sam, who's trying to make Hassenpfeffer, of course, because the very flighty king has every day the same thing, variety. Bring me Hassenpfeffer, and he has to go find a rabbit, and of course. That's the sympathies are with both Yosemite Sam and Bugs Bunny in this situation, because Yosemite Sam is absolutely the antagonist, but also you feel for him because he's in this situation where he has no agency except to try and fulfill the will of this really petulant king.
Yeah.
So
capricious monarchy.
Yes. Yeah. The capricious monarch. And that was used effectively in Babylon 5, where the Centauri had Cartagia. They had a series of emperors. There are 4 emperors that we see in Babylon 5. The first of whom is the older one, who's very wise, but has sort of presided over a difficult time. And then there's Cartagia, who is basically Caligula, he's modeled on Caligula. And then you have, I'm not going to spoil it for people who haven't seen it, but 2 other characters in succession become emperor. And they're all very different. And the fate of the planet and the empire is very different based on, who they are. But interestingly, the main characters, even the ones who later become emperor, we don't see them much when they're emperor because they lose a lot of agency once they're on the throne. Their freedom of movement, their freedom to get into fist fights, that sort of thing, right? They don't make as good protagonists, which is why again in Star Trek, where the captain is kind of like the local emperor, that's why Kirk is always beaming down to planets, which is just really weird, right? At least Picard sends an away team and stays on the bridge, runs his ship like he's supposed to. So they kind of fix that, but it's an interesting dilemma, right? If you're writing and you're creating a situation, if you go with the actual ruler as your protagonist, then you have to deal with they have a lot of agency in the political sphere, maybe if it's not a shadow council kind of monarchy, but they can't just drop everything and go adventuring. Yeah. So, you might want to pick the third kid or something like that in a primogeniture kind of society where because there's also a lot of sympathy for that. I mean, Prince Harry's book Spare, right? Aaron Spare, that sold well, right? In America, where he is absolutely not the prince.
Lives of the rich and famous.
Yeah. But people wanted to read okay, how can you be literally the second son of the King of England and have a miserable life? I want to read all about that, right?
I always thought that after the end of Lord of the Rings, I felt great sympathy for Aragorn, who's had this wonderful life of adventure and danger and heroism and all this stuff, and just buried under paperwork for 100 years.
Yeah,
Didn't
no
he
longer
want to
being a
sneak out
ranger
of the
in
castle
Anduin.
and just incognito?
Yeah, that's what success looks like at the end of the journey, right? I mean, on the
that's
other hand, Frodo is he's not a monarch, but he is an oligarch in a way, right? He comes from a very wealthy family. But Sam, who is a commoner in terms of his speech patterns, his Cockney speech patterns and his social class, he's the gardener, son of a gardener, becomes mayor of Hobbiton. So in the end of the saga, and lasts for a long time as mayor, whereas Frodo is, in a very real sense, already dead. Right? He doesn't really survive the Lord of the Rings. He just sort of comes back and dwells in the Shire for a while, and then goes off to the west and dwells there until his body expires. But he's not really in the Shire anymore in a very real way, right? That was interesting, right? The choices that Tolkien made, and to have he has less of a monarchy versus democracy kind of battle as a agrarian society versus an industrial society kind of battle. That's the big fight in his mind, right? And I'm glad Peter Jackson put a lot more character into Aragorn, because in the books he's just noble and good. And
But he's wrapped with self-doubt in the books. Didn't Jackson
more in the movie? That's really brought front and center in the movie version.
No, I would argue it's just the opposite.
Really?
When you read the book, it's like,
we should have a whole Lord of the Rings discussion.
Yeah. Every time you turn around, he's doubting himself. He's agonizing over having made a mistake, or he's going to make a mistake. I mean, it's like a broken record. Finally, he gets with the program, but
you've read the books and seen the movies way more than I have.
My husband and I read them aloud at bedtime quite recently, so it's very much in my mind that I think Aragorn's constant self-questioning and self-doubt were one of the things that made him fit to be king, because it wasn't, I'm so hotsy-totsy and I'm this great warrior and I'm so wise, and so it's like no, just terrified that he's going to become a despot.
Unlike Denethor, really.
Yeah.
Although Faramir and Boromir both had that tendency, right, of self-doubt.
Boromir did. Faramir not so much.
Anyway, I think, I don't know. I'm currently, I've started reading The Lord of the Rings to my older kids, like in the last week. We're in chapter 1. So I'll get back to you in a few months about my latest impressions, because it's been a while. So, and I'm going on fuzzy human memory here. So Bob appeared and then vanished again because he saw we were still being interesting. Darn it.
Oh, you guys are all being interesting.
We're always interesting.
I know I'm taking up your time, but I have to ask your guests a question.
Oh, go for it.
Okay. I mean, I've always loved fantasy, and don't be insulted, but one of the first and greatest fantasy novels or collections, anthologies ever written was the Bible. Okay.
A lot of monarchy.
And when you talk about monarchy, my first introduction to monarchy was not the kings and queens of England, but it was the making of King Saul.
Mm-hmm.
And we were warned about that. And we don't want a king.
I find that to be very relevant to the discussion you're having, because it gave you some examples of the troubles of being the king. You have your prophet, I forget his name, started with a D, but Samuel was the prophet.
Samuel was the prophet.
That just said, basically, guys, you don't know what you're getting into. You're not sure you want a king. You got yourself a nice little community here that's working. But they said, oh, no. We want a king. We want a strong man to be in charge. Now, I don't know.
We want to be like all the other kingdoms around.
Yep.
Yeah.
One of Saul's qualifications for rulership is he stood a head higher than everyone else.
Now, I honest to God think if anybody wanted to really write the interesting book, they would have done a better job of it than I think it was Samuel did that wrote this one, because I would have had when Saul and Jonathan are standing on the mountain beset by the Philistines, people falling all around. Right after Saul falls on his sword and Jonathan realizes that his all is lost, I'd have had David come riding in over the hill with a troop of heavy cavalry and break them free. And then he could have become the Lancelot for King Jonathan. And there's an alternative history for you to write.
Well, Tolkien did something similar at Helm's Deep, right?
Yeah, well, I have found the concept of the kings interesting. And you notice the question I asked you about the permissions necessary to be king. For in this case, it took the anointing of the church, the blessing of the church, for Saul to be a king. And how many kings, even in modern times, did it take either the acceptance of the leader of either the Catholic Church or the Protestant Church to be allowed to be king of a given country? So, I mean, never underestimate religion when you're talking about kings and the forces and the powers that let them be. But I am not here to lecture you guys on this. I'm here to tell you how much I appreciated your discussion and how much it inspired give some thoughts within my own head about how all this works. Either y'all familiar with a Terry Mancour?
The
Okay,
name
that's
does
a
not
big.
ring a bell.
Okay, he is he writes fantasy after fashion, but one of the things he writes is he writes heavily about the feudal system, and the king is at the top there, and he's kind of above, and every now and then you get to bring him in, but he really truly gives a good vision of what the feudal system was like, how hard it was to really raise an army, how hard it was to keep an army, how much at the mercy of your neighbors. You were talking about all the kingdoms in Germany that says if you're a small kingdom and the neighboring kingdom just happens to have had a growth spurt over the past 10 years, you may be their next meal, and there's nobody there to stop it. And the person that can eat enough of those handy little mini kingdom meals is suddenly going to turn into the 500-pound gorilla. I just, the truth of the monarchy is just amazing. And I think sometimes our focus on the English version and not always looking over to what was going on in France and Germany gives us a slightly skewed perspective on it. But you guys have all done wonderful work. So thank you. Now, did I say anything stupid to annoy you?
I don't know.
I wouldn't say it's stupid to annoy, but there is no government that can be run by one person. You can't even run a household without help from everybody else. And therefore, that line in the Declaration of I think it's in the Declaration of Independence about ruling with the consent of the governed. There's always people underneath the king and the monarch who can screw it up for them because the king cannot do everything.
Yeah.
And that's even more true in the Middle Ages when there was no good communication.
Oh, yeah. You meaning the guy that really pissed off the peasants in the richest part of your kingdom, and all of a sudden you have a peasants' revolt, and now it's your problem?
Yes. Alexander the Great had, an enormous empire, and it fell apart the minute he died.
Yeah. If he had maybe lived another 25, 30 years, it may have he may have been able to establish, but you
Maybe,
never
but he
know.
was more interested in conquering more territory than he was in setting up a bureaucracy that would survive him.
I will give you a counter theory there, and it's an uninformed one, so you can dismiss it without prejudice. That it would have, if he had kept at it longer and kept conquering, it would have become necessary for the maintenance of his kingdom that those systems evolved in the conquered territories, and he had smart enough people around him to recognize that. And he may have at some point came home from all of his conquering when he got that last little wound he could no longer conquer, and found that there was another emperor in the throne that really wasn't ready to let that distant general come back and have his spot.
It's entirely possible that he would have set up systems, because it's essentially the same as logistics, and he was a his logistics were just amazing. But it's a moot point, because but
Sure.
it makes for great alternate history.
Yeah, there is no shortage of inspiration for stories in history.
That is true.
And sometimes you got to peel the labels off a little better than some people do. But it is, because if you don't peel them off too much, they get sticky. But thank you guys so much. And I wish you will come back. And now I'm going to tell you something, both, that BQ Press is doing a monarchy anthology, only we're calling it Retribution and Revenge, the Second Coming of Donald Trump, about the American monarchy. We pick on poor Donald a lot, but what it is, it's going to be a series of anthologies about what this next 4 years could be like if things go south. And it's going to be dark and funny. And the best funny is dark. And the best dark is funny. So if you guys have any interest in something like that, give us a call. Give me an email. You've got my email. And tell me you're interested. And I'll make sure I get you an invite. Because we love having fun and getting books out. And you guys obviously have put out some great books of your own. And Cliff, we just put up the one he put out with David Boop, one of the most incredibly emerging editors out there right now these days. Seems like what he touches turns gold, and he does a great job of it. And so any closing thoughts?
Just that the story I have in High Noon on Proxima B, which is the title story, is set in the future. It doesn't have monarchy per se, but it does have hereditary rulership of really powerful corporations, mining corporations, and so it functions like monarchy. And my protagonist is the sheriff of the town of High Noon, and she has to deal with basically a throne war that's happening above her head with these mining corporations in the Proxima Centauri system.
That's an interesting point, Cliff. A whole lot of books have been written about the rich cattle baron, the rich miner, the rich industrialist, whose son is no better suited to take the throne of the business than a lot of kings were to princes were to take over the role of the king.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And that's
rags to riches to rags in 3 generations.
Yeah.
That used to be a saying.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Still
rags
kind of
to riches to rags in 3 generations.
Yep.
It's a phenomenon.
It. I really do. I'll have to look it up, because I found out one thing, folks. Life is not long enough to write all the books you want to write. And all you can do is keep working at it and get as much out as you can and have as much fun as you can doing it. And if you're not, I don't know. Just keep working at it. Keep enjoying. Deborah, it was a pleasure as always.
Thank you, Bob.
And thank you. And it was a great meeting you two there. God, I forgot your name. Pat.
Pat. There's a name tag on her picture.
Oh, yeah. Did you notice I'm not wearing my glasses? So, it takes me a long time to remember names. But we'll get there. And Cliff, as always, you make a wonderful host. And so I'm going to say goodbye, folks.
Goodbye, folks.
Goodbye, folks.